You're holding your baby at a gathering. Someone perfectly pleasant leans in, a relative who has met your baby before, someone smiling, someone who poses absolutely zero threat to anyone in the room. And before they get within arm's reach, your baby detonates. Not a fuss, not a whimper. A full body, arching, reaching, face collapsing explosion of something that looks less like a tantrum and more like genuine animal panic. The kind of fear that makes the other person step back with their hands up. You laugh apologetically. You say she's just tired. You say he's going through a phase. You spend the next 10 minutes trying to reassure both the baby and the relative, vaguely embarrassed, mostly baffled, thinking, what was that? Developmental neuroscientists have spent decades asking the exact same question because what you just watched wasn't a phase. It wasn't tiredness. It wasn't even shyness. What you watched was one of the most precisely timed, neurologically sophisticated events in all of human development, executing on a schedule written into your baby's brain before they were born, and understanding what is actually happening inside that tiny skull. In that moment doesn't just change how you see the fear. It changes how you understand everything you do in response to it. The common explanation, the one you'll hear from well-meaning relatives, from parenting books, from the corner of your own mind that wants a simple answer, is that babies are too young to feel real fear. What looks like terror, the reasoning goes, is just overstimulation. Too many faces, too much noise, too much input flooding a system that isn't built to process it yet. Sensory overload, not an emotion. This sounds reasonable. It has the structure of reassurance. Newborns can't speak, they can't reason, they can't construct a threat narrative. Surely a brain that is still figuring out how to track a slow-moving mobile can't be generating something as complex as genuine terror. Here's the problem with that. By approximately 2 months of age, roughly 60 days after birth, before most parents have had a single uninterrupted night of sleep, the amygdala is not only present, but functionally active. Researchers can measure it responding to threat cues in real time. And the amygdala does not wait for the rest of the brain to come online. It was never designed to. Fear does not require reason. It predates reason by hundreds of millions of years of evolutionary history. It is, in the architecture of the brain, one of the oldest pieces of infrastructure in the entire building. Your baby isn't overwhelmed. Your baby is afraid. And their brain is doing exactly what evolution designed it to do. But here's where it gets deeper. Because the fear your baby feels isn't a simplified beginner version of adult fear. In certain specific measurable ways, it is more intense. Researchers at Harvard Medical School, working alongside the Infant Brain Imaging Study, a multi-site neuroimaging consortium examining early brain development, have used infant-adapted functional MRI protocols and salivary cortisol sampling to map what actually happens in a frightened infant brain. Functional MRI adapted for infant use requires motion-tolerant imaging protocols. Cortisol sampling measures the stress hormone directly in saliva, confirming that the physiological response is real and not just behavioral distress. What they found reshapes the picture entirely. In infants, the amygdala fires in response to threat cues at full intensity. The alarm is loud, and it is genuine. But the prefrontal cortex, the region that in adults pumps the brakes, contextualizes the threat, generates the internal voice that says it's fine, it's just a loud noise, it's just a stranger, you're safe, is not yet meaningfully connected to the amygdala. The regulatory highway between those two regions is still under construction. Basic functional connectivity doesn't emerge until around 24 months. Some of the deeper regulatory pathways aren't finished until adolescence. Think of the adult fear system as a machine with an engine and functioning brakes. The infant fear system is the same engine, the same output, the same horsepower. But the brakes haven't been installed yet. When the amygdala fires, there is nothing internal to stop it. 24 months. That is 730 days of feeling fear at full electrical force with no wiring in place to quiet it from the inside. Every alarm is a 5-alarm event. There is no volume dial. Your baby isn't overreacting. Your baby is feeling the full force of fear with none of the circuitry that would allow them to talk themselves down from it. Now I need to tell you about what triggers that alarm. Because the fears your baby develops don't appear randomly as the baby encounters frightening things in the world. They follow a precise biological schedule, and that schedule tells us something striking about how the human brain's threat system was originally constructed. Research published in Developmental Psychobiology, drawing on decades of fear, milestone studies across multiple developmental laboratories, including work out of the University of California, Berkeley, has documented a pattern that holds across cultures, across environments, across wildly different individual babies. Stranger anxiety emerges at approximately 6 to 8 months. Separation anxiety peaks between 10 and 18 months. Fear of sudden loud noises is present at birth, the very first day. These are not learned through bad experiences. They are not triggered by exposure to frightening events. They arrive on a timetable set by the genome in a fixed sequence, whether or not the baby has ever encountered anything remotely threatening. This seems counterintuitive until you understand what each window corresponds to. At 6 months, an infant is old enough to be mobile, old enough to be separated from their primary caregiver by an unfamiliar adult. At 10 months, an infant who loses contact with their caregiver in an open environment has a survival window measured in hours, not days. The brain is running threat detection software that was written for a world that no longer exists, executing on a calendar that was set long before the baby drew their first breath. That window of stranger anxiety, the 6 to 8 month span during which a baby who beamed at every passing face 2 months earlier will now treat an unfamiliar adult as a credible emergency, lasts roughly 60 days. Nothing external changed. The faces are the same faces, the environment is the same environment, only the genome's timer ticked forward. Your baby isn't afraid of your neighbor. Your baby's brain is running a survival program 200,000 years old, and your neighbor walked into frame at exactly the wrong developmental moment. Now I need to tell you about what your response to that fear actually does to your baby's brain. Because this is where the science stops being interesting in a general sense and starts being specifically, personally about you. In 1960, Eleanor Gibson and Richard Walk at Cornell University designed what became one of the most replicated experiments in all of developmental psychology: the visual cliff. A glass-topped table, shallow on one side with a deep drop visible beneath the glass on the other. A cliff edge that the baby can see but cannot fall through. Crawling-age infants are placed on the shallow side. Their caregiver stands on the far side, across the apparent drop, and calls them forward. Most infants hesitate at the edge. They look down, they look up, and then they look at the caregiver's face. In later adaptations of this paradigm, research associated with James Source and Robert Emday at the University of Colorado, caregivers were instructed to hold specific expressions as the infant approached the apparent drop. When the caregiver displayed a fearful face, almost every infant stopped. Would not cross. When the caregiver displayed an encouraging, open expression, the majority moved forward across the glass. The infant was not primarily assessing the visual cliff. The infant was reading the caregiver's face and using it as their threat calibration instrument. And this is called social referencing, and it turns out to be far more than a cute behavioral quirk. Through a mechanism developmental researchers call co-regulation, your nervous system, specifically the regulatory stability of your own prefrontal cortex, can directly modulate the activity of your baby's amygdala. Your calm expression doesn't just make the baby feel emotionally better. It does something structural. It stands in for the breaks they don't yet have. You are, in the most literal neurological sense, external regulatory hardware. The architecture of your child's long-term stress response, how readily the alarm fires, how quickly it quiets, how their threat system calibrates across a lifetime, is being constructed right now in these moments, out of the raw material of your response. Your baby isn't just looking for comfort. Your baby is borrowing your nervous system to regulate their own. And what you lend them right now becomes the template for how they handle fear for the rest of their life. And now I need to say something important. Because there are patterns within this fear system, specific observable things that matter, and that most parents don't know to look for. The first thing to understand is that fear in infancy is one of the most variable systems in all of early development. Some babies are high reactivity infants by temperament, more easily activated, more intense, quicker to alarm, and that is a trait. It is not a disorder. The question is never whether your baby is afraid. Every baby is afraid. The question is whether the shape of the fear matches what typical development looks like. There are a few patterns worth paying attention to. A fear response that cannot be quieted by your presence after 6 months, persistent, inconsolable distress that your co-regulatory calm does not reach, is different from initial distress that settles. The complete absence of expected fear milestones is also worth noting. a baby who shows no differentiation between familiar and unfamiliar faces in the 6 to 12 month window, who never seems to register strangers as different from known caregivers, and fear responses that appear without any identifiable trigger or extreme reactions to specific sensory input, particular sounds, textures, lights, especially alongside other sensory sensitivities, are worth raising with someone who can look at the full picture. Developmental pediatricians consider the window between 9 and 18 months the most informative period for observing fear response patterns with any confidence. This is when the difference between intense but typical and something worth examining starts to come into focus. None of this is a diagnosis. Bringing something to a doctor's attention is not an alarm. It is information moving through the right channels at the right time. And the brain's capacity for change in the first 2 years of life is at a level it will never reach again. What gets addressed early gets addressed at the moment it is most addressable. You have watched your baby's face every single day since they were born. You know what their distress looks like. You know the difference between ordinary upset and something that feels categorically different. If the pattern of the fear feels wrong to you, too large, too frequent, too disconnected from what is actually happening in the room, that instinct is calibrated data. It has been refined by thousands of hours of observation that no researcher in a lab can replicate. Trust it. Because here's what all of this fear, all of this alarm and reaching and borrowing your nervous system is actually building toward. Fear is not the opposite of security. In the construction of early development, fear is the scaffold that security is built on. Every time your baby's amygdala fires and every time you answer it, with your face, your steadiness, your body, something is being written into the deepest infrastructure of their nervous system. Not the lesson that the world is safe. Something more precise than that. The lesson that when the alarm fires, something comes. That they are not alone inside it, that the outside world responds to what is happening inside them. That lesson, laid down in the first 2 years of life in the language of cortisol and co-regulation, is what developmental psychologists call the foundation of secure attachment. And secure attachment is the most robustly studied predictor of adult emotional resilience, relationship quality, and capacity to face difficulty that developmental science has ever documented. You are not just calming a frightened baby. You are writing the first chapter of how a human being will meet fear for the rest of their life. Every time you show up steady, you are telling them the alarm is real, and so is the answer to it. So the next time your baby detonates at a perfectly harmless face leaning too close, remember what is actually happening. A threat detection system older than language has fired at full intensity through a brain with no internal brakes, on a genetic schedule written before your baby ever existed. They are not being dramatic. They are not going through a phase. They are being precisely, remarkably human in a way that took 200,000 years to engineer. And in the middle of all that alarm, they are doing one specific thing. They are looking at your face to find out whether the world ends here. Tell me in the comments, what was the fear moment that stopped you cold? The one where your baby was utterly terrified of something so ordinary you couldn't make sense of it. How old were they? What triggered it? I want to know, because the range of this is wider than most parents realize, and I think you'll find you're in very large company. And if you want to understand why your baby sometimes bursts into tears the moment they see you after you've been away, not because they're angry at you, not because they're being manipulative, but because of something happening inside their attachment system that most parents read entirely backwards, that is the next video. And once you understand what's actually going on, you will never feel hurt by that reaction again.